Come from heaven, violent winds appear as of fire. Each one hears it speak, a snare's fanfare, a soul-strike cymbal soft, strings breathe through me, 4 notes praying a love supreme, seeks to share, give away in each measure, a live moment, a mourned moment, a fierce moment. Releasing innocence, a flood of lightning in a summer cloud, heaving wind shakes the waves, balancing violent seas in serenity. Dissonant slurs, honking exultations, no brass, no gong, 4 notes dropping to their knees, hymning his love to Amen, Amen, Amen. A meditation on the love supreme is a poem that appears in a book of my poems called Haitian Mud Pies and Other Poems. So tonight, the theme of our show is the music of poetry and the poetry of music, and we have an excellent guest here on Philly Loves Poetry. So first, let's talk about Philly Loves Poetry. It's a collaborative effort between the Moonstone Arts Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCam. Our focus is to give our audiences, both here in the studio and at home, the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia, and to understand that there are over 50 organizations in Philadelphia that in some way or other bring poetry to people in Philadelphia, to our communities and neighborhoods, by either offering special poetry readings, special poetry events, in offering workshops to poets of all ages and all styles, both poets on the page and poets on the stage. We also have to understand in Philadelphia, we publish poems, both in print and electronically, and we offer poetry of all styles in this city. So on any given night in Philadelphia, somewhere near you work or live, you can find somebody reading poetry. So tonight, as I said, the theme of our show is the poetry of music and the music of poetry, and we have a remarkable guest to really both discuss it and perform it for us, and that is Elliot Levin. He is a Philadelphia-born and based poet and musician. He's our own. He studied musical and literary composition at the University of Oregon. Elliot has done further studies with Michael Guerra of the Philadelphia Orchestra, Cecil Taylor, pianist, composer, poet, Claire Pollan, flutist, composer, and Odeon Pope, saxophonist and composer. Elliot has performed throughout the world with such groups as the Cecil Taylor Ensemble, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, New Ghost, Interplay, Talking Free Bebop, Odeon Pope's Saxophone Choir, Don Preston's Akashic Ensemble, Cease Knowledge and Cosmic Funk Orchestra, Alan Silva's Sound Vision Orchestra. Elliot has collaborated in performances with many poets, including Miguel Agaran, Bob Holman, Gloria Trope, Reggie Gaines, John Sinclair, Butch Morris, Chorus of Poets, Will Perkins, Frank Messina, and David Anram. Elliot has received grants from the New American Radio in New York, the City of Los Angeles Cultural Affairs Department, the California Endowment of the Humanities, and Meet the Composer. Elliot's original music and poetry can be found on the recordings Olduvai Music and Iltar, both on Tiwa Records. Elliot was the associate producer, composer, and performer for compilations Poetry in Philadelphia in 1989 and Music from Philadelphia in 1990. As producer, composer, performer in 1990 and 1992, Elliot created 2 internationally broadcast features for New American Radio, including the compositions A Gift of Ghost, Subterranean Feel Holy Feast of All, and Whose Myth Are Yous With. These are also released on Philadelphia Music compilation If It Dropped in Your Neighborhood in 1995. In 1993, Whose Myth was used as a title and as the feature work in a multidisciplinary event sponsored by the Watts Tower Council Center in Los Angeles. Juan, is that correct? Juan? H-U-A-N?
Juan, yes.
Is
Juan.
a poetic musical duet performed and recorded at the Berlin Total Music Meeting with Cecil Taylor in 1996. A Bleak, Stark Beauty and Northern Liberties were performed and recorded for the Fire in the Valley Festival in Amherst, Massachusetts, with the Jackson Crowd Quintet. The Motion of Emotion CD was released by Elliott Levin Quartet in 1998 on CIMP, followed by A Fine Intensity, Soul Etude, or in Onondaga. I hope I'm saying that right.
I think so, Onondaga.
Onondaga. New Ghost, Live Upstairs at Nick's was released by ESP Disc in 2006. Elliott's first book of poetry, Does It Swing, was published in 1996 by Heat Press of LA in collages and brocolages. Catherine Graham's review states, "This stuff does more than swing. It dances and sings with a resonance of heart crafted to reach our intellectual, emotional, and spiritual lives with intimate sounds, tastes, smells, and touch." Elliott's musical and poetic inspirations are drawn from the roots of American forms of jazz and blues, along with many other international cultural, folk, and classical forms, to grow into the more expansive techniques of the extended compositional, improvisational directions of modern innovators such as Cecil Taylor, Sun Ra, Frank Zappa, and Don Van Lett, to cite a few sources of inspiration.
Also known as Captain Beefheart.
Captain Beefheart, okay, we know him.
Great poet.
For the past 25 years, Elliott has been intimately involved in the integral interplay of the language of music and the music of language. So, welcome, Elliott.
Thank you. That's nice.
So, in the poem that I read in the beginning, I mentioned about this inspiration, and it was really taken from the Feast of the Pentecost, and the Pentecost in the Bible, which in a very summary way to say is the story of the Lord appearing to different groups of people of different languages, but they all understood the Holy Spirit. And for me, John Coltrane's Love Supreme and so much of his music and other people's music is like that. It transcends language and we understand it, but we really understand it in words and language. So having said that, how do you respond to that? I mean, is that authentic to say that?
I think very much, yeah. From what I've researched in my life, I've seen that it seems that language, spoken word, really came from encompassing the vibration of the thing that you were speaking about. And so language was considered like sacred, which is why in many religious cultures you couldn't even write or speak the word God, because it was just too much for human beings to be able to comprehend what God was, so you couldn't really appropriately represent it in a word or in a written symbol. So there became abbreviations and things. But the point is, music is vibration, and words, speaking is vibration. Any sound, all existence is vibration pretty much. And it's just different ways of interpreting it and tapping into it, I think, And I started out really in my younger life as a writer. I started writing at a very young age. I was doing plays and prose and started doing poetry, but I didn't really start playing music seriously until a little later in my life, like as I was getting out of high school. And very young in my life, I was very fortunate to meet the great teacher, musician, poet Cecil Taylor, and he inspired me a lot. And I met some people through that circle that, we started forming ensembles and doing things. And Cecil always encouraged using poetry as part of a performance. And very early on, I remember we were doing a festival one time at the Trenton Avant-Garde Festival. It was probably like 75, 76. And playing this big open amphitheater, a lot of people on a beautiful day. And while we were playing, I had a piece that I had been working on, and I just said, you know, I heard it in the music. I heard it as part of the music, and I just started performing it, and it just, the musicians responded in a very beautiful way, and it just encouraged me, and I've been doing it ever since. So it was like, that was one of the time. I mean, it had been building for a while, but I remember at that specific time, the music and poetry started becoming interchangeable in my mind, you know. And now I write sometimes the words, and I add the music. Sometimes the music add the words, but it's all kind of the same process.
So talk about the intersection with, you know, a giant like Cecil Taylor. How did that all come about?
You know, Cecil was invited to be artist in residence at Glassboro University, which is now Rowan. While, you know, I heard that he was going to be there, and I was living in Philadelphia, and some musicians that I was playing with were living in Glassboro and playing there, going to school there. There was a teacher named Joel Thome, who was a great musician, and I believe he might have been responsible for bringing Cecil there. And anyway, I happened to be there the day that his first concert and workshop, and at the end of the concert, which was a phenomenal concert, he invited whoever wanted, you know, students or not, to come and sit in on his classes. And so it turned out that the 90% of the class was musicians like myself from the area just sitting in, and so he quickly formed a band out of that. And instead of coming to class, we came to rehearsal.
Okay.
And then he formed an ensemble in New York, which he invited me to come up, and I started doing that. And so that was 1973, 74. And I was able to maintain a relationship, although there were large hiatuses, but until he passed away a couple months ago. You know.
You essentially come out of the same generation of me from the 60s and the 70s, and I mean, that was really a transformative period for music and art and poetry. Can you speak to that, how it helped shape your music, and specifically, you know, that fusion between poetry and music? Because in some ways we look back to the beat poets, and, you know, we see that as, you know, kind of the ground level, you know, for that kind of fusion, but it was carried on in a very different way as you know, the 60s and 70s progressed. Can you speak to that?
That's interesting, yeah, because you know, of course I knew Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. I mean, I knew who they were, and I'd seen Ginsberg quite a few times read, and some of the other poets from that era. But Cecil Taylor actually introduced me to the person that he considered the root of the beat poetry movement, Bob Kaufman, who was, you know, very interesting to say the least. He was, I think, part African American, part Russian Jewish heritage, and he grew up in New Orleans. So that's an interesting mixture right there. And they said that, you know, Cecil knew all of them. And he told me one time he had a dinner with Bob Kaufman, Allen Ginsberg, and Burroughs, I think Kerouac. And he said that Kaufman totally dominated. His energy and his persona and his vibration was just on top, and they all kind of looked at him as like a leader of that. You know, he was very much into spontaneously creating poetry and doing it like a jazz musician would create a solo. And they said in his height of his, you know, then he moved to San Francisco at a certain point. They say he could improvise poetry for like an hour or 2 hours, whatever. He would just go and go, and he was like phenomenal. And they even named the street after him in San Francisco, Bob Kaufman Street. Okay. So he's like a legend. So I think he was really one of the roots of what I do, you know, for sure. Even I never got to see him live. Another interesting thing about him was like when John F. Kennedy got shot, he took a vow of silence. And they say he didn't speak or write a word for 10 years. And then the legend is that he broke it by walking into a coffee house in San Francisco and just started reciting a poem, like an epic poem, and that was like the first time he spoke. Wow. So that's a very interesting, I hope it's true, I believe it probably is.
So how's a music composition come through as poetry? I mean, sometimes it's hard to articulate that in words, but how for you does it come through as poetry?
Music composition?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I have a piece that I just submitted to this thing, the Philadelphia Fake Real Book. They're compiling scores of Philadelphia composers. You know, there's so many great musicians here and so many people writing beautiful original music. So I was fortunate to be able to submit this, and it's a piece that I wrote specifically where every word, every syllable is designated a note, and I perform it both as a poem and as a music performance. So, you know, that's one way of doing it. I mean, that's not the only way. Of course, there's many, you know, we were talking about influences. I was very into the folk scene back when I was that young, you know, listening to like Bob Dylan, of course, who was I think a very great poet. People, Phil Oakes, Richard Farina, Mimi and Richard Farina, stuff like that. Of course, there was people like The Last Poets and what was that great album, The Hustlers Convention, which were the beginnings of what became known as rap, you know. And I was listening to a lot of that back then too. I was very influenced by that. And there's one other person I should mention. You mentioned her, Gloria Trapp, actually, and her husband, Stephen Trapp, was a great poet. He was one of the beat poets in New York. And she would accompany him with her voice. And she kind of does with her voice what I try to do with my saxophone. She just creates these incredible sounds. Nothing to do with notes or words. She's just totally about sound and energy and improvisation. She's still with us. She's still in New York, and I wish I could get her to come to Philly again. I brought her down one time. We did a poetry festival at the Painted Bride, and it was a very beautiful event. And she, you know, because of her age and her health, she doesn't come out so much anymore. But that, to me, that's the closest. She's one of the closest people I've ever met that really heard, you know, I heard exactly what she was doing. She was taking the sounds of the words and everything and creating this energy. I don't know how else to describe it. She just has a very unique sound and way to perform. And it's kind of just what I was saying, mixing everything. You know, my first album, you mentioned, it was the language of music, the music of language. It's the emotion of motion and the motion of emotion. And that came from a great Russian writer I like very much. Not too many people seem to know him. I think Emagayev, his name was. And he wrote this novel called Novel with Cocaine, which was about the poetry music scene in Odessa in the early 1900s, which was very much like Greenwich Village, maybe 50 years later. And interestingly, that's where a lot of my family comes from. So I feel very at home in that culture, I guess. But the point is, that came from his novel, and that always was, it's like the same thing, the language of music, the music of language, the emotion of motion, and the emotion of emotion.
You referenced this poem that you were talking about. Can you read that for us?
Which one?
The one you were talking about.
Oh, yes. I was going to actually perform it, too, with the music. Would you want to do it now?
Yeah, go
sure,
ahead.
Why not? Sounds good. I don't know if we tested the flute yet, but I assume it should be okay. If there's a problem, signal me, let me know. Okay, I call this the Jazz Poetry to Complete Communion. The in omni ses present. Inevitability spent. Sense of events lent. To grasping the elusive. Brass golden ring. Grass boldened. Bring it on. Stop. Platitudinous attitudes. Attuned and accrued to the long haul and the latitudes it takes to make it, to fix or break. Go tell a vision of the shape of all that jazz. To come.
Okay, thank you. So just in terms of that piece, what do you feel musically you've learned from poetry? You know, I'm not talking about just translating words into music, but how has poetry fed back to you, you know, in that musical sense and driven that? And are there particular poets, you know, within the realm that you feel that are more representative of that, you know, devotion to within their art form to music?
Yeah, I think a lot of the people that were mentioned already, I actually, it's probably a little more the music influencing the poetry, because I always felt comfortable writing. In a way, maybe I was born more with a poetic sense or a literal sense than a musical sense. But when I started, you know, but the ideas came fast and easy, and I could think of, you know, ways to utilize words, but it never felt really satisfying. When I started playing music, I could hear the music behind the words, and then it gave the rhythm and the spontaneity that I needed, and it became, to perform the poems became a lot more meaningful for me, you know, when I heard the music behind them.
And the language of poetry in different languages, do you feel that English as English is not really that representative of music as, say, if you Spanish or French or, you know, Italian, of course, is that they lend themselves in and of themselves to music by the very structure of their language?
Yeah, I think first of all I speak American,
Right.
So that's a whole nother language, and that's another rhythm, and you know, there's so many different forms of that. You know, I speak a kind of West Philadelphian American, maybe. I mean, people have recognized it. I've met people in other parts of the world, and they heard me talking. They say, "You're from Philadelphia, aren't you?"
Yeah.
And I don't even think I have much of a Philadelphian accent, but it's there enough that people can hear it. So it's interesting. Yeah, there's certain, like, you know, of course. Well, I have another piece that it's interesting that you mentioned this, because I utilize. I don't speak any of these languages fluently, but I utilize some Hebrew, some Arabic, some Spanish, and even Esperanto, which was the international language, you know. And I think those languages all have a very kind of musical, you know, rhythmic flow that English doesn't necessarily have. But Americans have co-opted English into a whole other thing, and you hear it on the radio all over the world. You know, you hear what young Americans are considering poetry. So,
yeah, I mean, I speak my Spanish is not great, but I myself will read a poem in Spanish that I do not completely understand, just for the musical quality of it. I read a lot of Neruda. Long Neruda poems, right. And to me,
I've done that also. That's interesting.
It's like putting on music and you know, just getting carried away, you know, with the music, even though, you know, there's an understanding of it.
For sure.
And I find that you know, in Spanish and in Latin American poets is that, you know, that drive and the force naturally of their language to be musical. But you know, in some ways I struggle to say the same thing.
Yeah.
But as you say, I do see it in street sounds, in people and dialects, especially Philadelphia. There are all kinds of, you know, like if you're from Kensington, people can tell you're from Kensington. If you're from Germantown, as you say, West Philadelphia,
right.
You can pick those up. We can, maybe some other people can't, but they know it. And there's a coolness to something like that.
I think so.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So you want to?
I can do that piece. Sure. I'd like to do this one on saxophone, I think. some liquid. You know, traveling around the world as a musician, I've done poems also in many of my performances, and I found exactly what you just said. Even in countries where they don't necessarily understand what I'm saying, they enjoy the poetry. Just maybe because I use the rhythm, and you know, I don't necessarily my voice. I don't know if it's that interesting, but to people overseas and other cultures, it seems to have interest. And our different forms of American, the different idiosyncrasies we have in our speech, in our slang, whatever you want to call it. It's contemporary language. This piece I wrote right before the presidential election, and it's called Yehi Or, which in Hebrew means let there be light. It's the beginning of the Old Testament. In Arabic, I believe, I'll try my best, the Al-Nur Ya'ibor Ilahu Neka. In Spanish, it's Hágase la luz. In Esperanto, it's Estulumo. The Al-Nur Ya'ibor Ilahu Neka. Hágase la luz, Estulumo. Yehi Or. Clinking and trumplings, bid, tid, bit, titillationary tactics, hidden, sleight of hand, held mitten, hat tricks, viva their side, swipe, sniped, happy girls talking. The things you're loath to do, just too gruesome of the time for all of the people and all for one fool in a day in the life of. Away from the first lady, waif of the first faded animal husbandry and magnetism, a stigmatized minimal magnanimous mesmerism of the muddled masses, murmuring to be freedom down of the state of the nation. Neither hide nor hair of trumple, stiltskin, petulant, stamped and tamped down races, sing your songs, zippity-doo-dads and crash pads, crashed and trashed, bagatelles and lashed, for 40 winks and the recipient of what it takes and what it thinks. Karaoke, but when and where, in matter of fact, to sing a simple song alone along with tacit tact, on track to massive attack, the darkness through the light.
Wow. Thank you. Wow, that's remarkable. Love that.
Thank you.
So what were you, I mean, I
Let me
hear the
just
words,
say,
yeah?
one thing, I'm sorry. I want to just, there's a group, organization in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Jazz Project that has been putting on a lot of performances, much needed jazz performances in the city and giving work to musicians here. And there was a situation coming up where they have 8 concerts of shows dedicated to Sun Ra, who was a great poet and a very strong influence on me poetically and musically. And I've done a few of these already, and the last one is going to be June 20th at the World Cafe Live. I hope it's cool to promote that, but it's going to be, and this is a piece that I'm working on for that concert. So
that's June 20th?
At the World Cafe Live, yes, with the Philadelphia Jazz Project. Sun Ra, Satellites of the Sun, it's called. Speaking
of jazz and jazz projects, where do you locate yourself within the genre of jazz? I mean, there are so many. I mean, while I was listening to that, I surely was thinking of, of Coltrane and that whole, that whole hard bop, that we're making that transition.
Well, you can't grow up in Philadelphia as a sax player without being influenced by John Coltrane, or anywhere in the world for that matter.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I've known some of those great musicians that worked with him, and Cecil was one, of course, and Odin Pope, a saxophone choir I worked with for quite a few years, and he was very close to that, that circle. Philadelphia has amazingly rich and powerful musical, especially jazz musical heritage, and so I was around a lot of that for many years, and I couldn't help but learn, even if I avoided it sometimes. But I've learned to love it and embrace it, certainly, man, and it's very powerful. Yeah.
So if somebody asked you, Elliot, can you tell me and describe what is your music? I mean, how do you describe your music? If somebody's saying, "Oh, could you describe your music?" Because people sit and they'll do, analysis, or they'll do reviews of you. So you're reviewing Elliot, and what would you say?
It's interesting. Many people over the years have had adverse reactions to the word jazz. The best, to my knowledge, it came from a word to have sex, from New Orleans, and the music that came to be known jazz was played in the brothels in New Orleans. So it was jazz music. It was music to accompany sexual activities by. So that's an interesting thing. But certainly the music has that element of that visceral element, which is very attractive to me and to the world, I believe. It has that gut, but it also has a very high spirit. John Coltrane was one of the people that took it to, of course, he had many people before him, like Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk and all these, Charlie Parker, all these great people that were bringing it to a higher level of consciousness, and he took it all the way, to that, the highest levels of consciousness he could take it to at a point where a lot of other people were seeking the same thing. The late 60s, which is when we grew up, is, man, in 1969. I was 15 years old, and I was checking out everything. You know, I was fortunate to have an older sister who was an artist, and she was around a lot of musicians. She worked at the Electric Factory, and she was buying me jazz records. And you know, I had some good exposure. My friends in high school, you know, but that was such a powerful time. I was also being turned on to African music. I heard Olatunji, and
Olatunji, yeah.
I started listening to, you know, and I found out a lot of that music was rooted in Philadelphia, because the Africans that came here came to Philly and taught musicians here, the drummers, to play, you know. And I was listening to a lot of Latin music and to Indian music, and now I play in a Balkan band, you know, West Philadelphia Orchestra. We do a lot of Eastern European music, which is very interesting. You know, I never really learned these things when I was younger, but as I, just adapting more and more different cultures, and you know, I guess that's the point of the world, right? We're trying to become one kind of consciousness, which really would be.
Yeah. Well, I think we.
Which is what that poem was about. Which is not happening. We're trying to be
one. But I don't
We're trying
think
to bring some light. That's what I do with my music.
Yeah, I think our artists are. I don't know about the rest of the world right now.
Well, I know. That's why we're needed. That's why
we need you.
We may not be making money, but we're, I think, creating a valuable service, and I'm proud and honored to be part of it.
Did you ever hear of a place, if you were, you know, a place called Peps?
Of course.
Yeah,
I live across the street from where it used to be.
Yes. Yeah.
Broad and South, yeah.
Yeah, and that's.
I never was there. Were you there? I never was there.
I was, and I actually saw John Coltrane there.
Beautiful, wow.
Before, in fact, the release of The Love Supreme. And as I said to people, I swear, one of those 4 parts he performed that night.
I believe
it was in him that night.
Sure,
and
yeah.
I can tell you, the other thing is that he was the most soulful, humble musician I've ever seen. I mean,
sure.
And very appreciative of his audience. You know, he loved his audience, and that's a great thing.
Yeah. Well,
you seem to have that same spirit.
It's you know what keeps me going. You know, that energy, that interplay between, even if it's 5 people in the audience, but they're really into it. It's a very healing, you know, event for everyone, I think. You know.
Can you give us another piece?
I would love to. Sure. Let's see what we got here. I can do, since we've been talking about Cecil so much, I like to do these pieces. One I wrote shortly before he passed, and the second part I wrote in his house, sitting with him the night that he left the earth. So they're nice pieces for me. They're very healing. Cease all tailored custom, Captain America. See all, tell tall, tell, toll, totality of soul, sir reality, sir royalty, roll of vintage homegrown spun handsome, throne made and tell in our own image, or seize all the time, to live is now. Fearless or more of a black hat is where it's at any given heaven-sent shore, perception holding up the Fort Greene King, Queen County, lonely hunter for the amount of bounty it takes to make a heartbreak whole again. Get down with fine upholstered recline with big screen, high volume scene, backline to the legend, myth and magical majesty of the hiply unpomp and circumstantial pageantry of barely missed maternally knife-tossed fist of fate. Circumtangentially spectful frontal naked state and unfaked art, Lady Day, Sir Night, earn the right to sing the blues. 4 a.m. Pass over the foot of the throne reclined, of last superhero, married with childhood's end, harried clandestine tribal rites, to bear arms and joyous dare charms, to fire until they see the black and whites of their eyes. Having seen the glory of the coming and going of the Lord and Maestro of the Fort Greene golden sword of duress, celebrated at either end nonetheless. TLC with TBS and drops of THC, and Morpheus ascending to the end of an iconic era to see and sell a tale or two for T-minus 89, a few macro daddy cosmic spade of divine, awesome, oral, orid pressure. The king went out for a walk, the hawk is on the wing, Almeida's spawned, and kin is drawn in elegant, cryptic, cursive, unfinished script, describing a Angie tribe beckoning king call and a song of a long, strange trip across a folded, buckled floor, across a folded, buckled floor, a gape, a face, a slip into darkness, a script of the flip of the lip, a part of a piece of my hardest space, with the toll taken, the whole of my soul to a higher place. Thank you.
So, can you talk to us about this instrument that you played, what it's called, where it comes from? And
I don't know what it's called. I used to teach in a music studio in Germantown, Maplewood Mall, Maplewood Music, many years ago. And teacher there, Bob Jordan, he found this. I found this in one of the room where I taught, and I said, "What is this? Whose is it?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "If nobody claims it, it's yours," and that's how I got it. Now, playing with David Amram many years later, I saw he has a whole family of these, and he had like about 5 or 6 ones, all the exact same design but different sizes. And there's a indentation here. It's apparently a mark of an instrument maker, maybe somewhere on the West Coast. I'm not sure. And I was told, but I never found out who it was. So.
Well, it looks like, it reminds me of something they call the Okana.
No, well, ocarina, but
yeah.
it's different because an ocarina is just one chamber.
Right.
This is actually a double flute.
Okay.
It's divided. There's 2 separate chambers and 2 blowholes and 2 fingerings. So it's a very interesting, unique instrument. Like, I mean, I've seen other, like I think in Peru, I've seen similar kind of flutes in other cultures. I know, but this is a very unique thing that somebody.
What other
designed.
instruments do you play other than these?
You know, I started as a kid playing recorder in school, and I played harmonica a little bit, but mainly then I started with flute. And I started with flute because I couldn't afford to get a saxophone. I was in high school, and I wanted to play sax. And a friend of mine, a guy, Richard Preston, a very old friend, great friend, musician and scientist, and just, you know, he found it, and he said, "I will give this to you if you," you know, he was cleaning out a house. He said, "I'll give this to you if you learn how to play it." And the way things have come together in my life, very synchronicitously. My first girlfriend in high school, my serious girlfriend I was with the last 2 years of high school, was a flute player. And she said, "Oh, I'll teach her how to play it." And I said, "Thank you very much." And she did, and helped me, and you know, I was on my way. And then fortunately, later, a couple years or so later, I met a saxophone player, very interesting, a guy, Walter Unterberger. He was playing in a band called Dead Cheese, which was a very progressive kind of fusion rock, Frank Zappa-ish kind of band in Philly. And he was great, and we started talking, and you know, he was playing very beautiful. And I found out that he was my cousin, a second cousin, and we had never met. You know, it was and he was a great sax player, so he gave me his old Con tenor, which I still have to this day. And you know, I ended up giving him a few $100 something for it, but it's worth much, much more. But anyway, so that's how I started playing saxophone.
Okay.
And then I met this wonderful teacher, Mike Guerra, who was a phenomenal, he taught Coltrane, he taught all the Philly orchestra people that came behind him. He was their teacher. And he was under Stokowski in the great orchestra with William Kincaid, who was the teacher of my flute teacher, Claire Poland, who I only got to study with briefly, but she was a brilliant, wonderful, interesting teacher in Philadelphia. And so yeah, that was, it's a lot of connections there, you know.
Okay, can you give us some more poetry?
Sure, yeah, I could do another one.
I was just going to say, when you talked about classical music, and I don't think a lot of people understand that how many jazz musicians actually practiced with, you know, classical scales and classical compositions.
Of course, yeah. Well, it's music. You know, it's just theory. It's mathematics. It's whatever.
Coltrane being one of them. I mean, you were very much used classical music.
Oh, very much. Well, everybody, you know, and Cecil graduated when he went to the New England Conservatory of Music.
Wow. Yeah.
But you know, he kind of said he had to reject all that at a certain point and just totally go a different direction. Right. But he obviously used that knowledge in a very powerful and interesting way, combining the greatest elements of that European tradition with the greatest elements of African and Latin and you know, American. You know, whatever. It's world music at this point, and you know, I'm glad that. The more the better. You know.
So what is this piece called?
This is called Artists for a Free World. Okay. And I guess it fits in the... I was doing some things. There's, you know, people at the Vision Festival in New York, and these people do concerts throughout the year in New York, and there's fewer and fewer places to play the kind of, like you said, what kind of music is it? People call it avant-garde, free jazz. I don't know. Most people I know that play don't like those terms. So I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure out a word for it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the music and the poetry speaks louder than those words. Artists for a free world, artists for a kinder, braver, old, new, free world order at the diner, as austerely stereo-archetypical 8th Avenue La Bonbonniere, half-bit burger and Asian fusion, Wiccan chicken wings and fries to make time freeze and fly, back to limbo, rockin' heaven, year stretch prior, new Texa Yorko fest of 1997, complete with pre-silk TSA screen muscle, t-shirt, the Pictionary omen of jet, I, care us, caress. Twirl too close to the sun, showers of love and affection, powers, slick, stick thin, bleak beaked blonde and Japarican supermodel, stealth, selfie tested, nested stool perched next to in transvestited interest, dated fashion doc, flick humanitarian, Friday night pick of the week, literally in Dutch with the crew in mother-daughter orientation, who resonantly croon Soviet Mooney and Ukraine, Alalian improvisatory cello-laced ornamentation and proclamation that we won't be better safe than sorry for the intro introduction eruption.
And that piece again is called?
Artists for a Free World. I was saying, I mentioned the vision thing. I was playing, we're doing these things in the park, in Washington Square Park last summer. Free concerts with a large ensemble and a kind of a marching band. And they were doing political rallies and different things too. And this was written at one of those events.
So where can people see you next and next? What's your
tonight,
calendar right?
You can come to Frankie Bradley's. I play every Tuesday there with the West Philly Orchestra. It's right up at 13th and Chancellor. Again, on the 20th, I'll be doing that performance at the World Cafe Live with the Satellites of the Sun. This Thursday, I'm playing at the Rotunda, which is University of Pennsylvania, 40th and Walnut,
right,
with a very interesting group, drummer named Chad Taylor and a bass player, a good friend of mine from Washington, D.C., Luke Stewart. And then another band, a guy from San Francisco, Mika Portocorvo, I believe. I'm just meeting him now, but he's doing a thing with Calvin Weston, who's also an old friend and collaborator. Mm-hmm. So that's coming up. And for this Saturday, the PIFA event, West Philly is playing on Broad Street. And Wednesday and Friday, I'm doing a sax quartet, another Philadelphia Jazz Project event at Franklin Square, I believe, which is at the foot of the Ben Franklin Bridge. Right. From at 1 and 3, we're doing these pop-up sax quartet performances. Cool. So
Wonderful.
That's the next couple of days anyway. Fortunately, it's a busy time. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great because it does not always. That's fortunate, believe me.
Well, I really appreciate you coming tonight. And I think
was
our audience
great,
did.
my
This, I
pleasure.
think it was
Honor.
a real education for us in that wonderful fusion and that place of poetry and music and poetry.
Yeah, I'm still
we all
figuring
see
it
it.
out. I think, man, but
We're all figuring it out.
exactly. It's coming together in a nice way. That's the one advantage of getting old, right? We actually get to maybe continue some projects
Yeah.
we started a long time ago.
Yeah, I want to really, Larry has talked about, Larry Robbins of Moonstone has talked about maybe having, we do Poetry Inc. every year, of course, with lots of poets, 85 poets, and you've been there, I've been there. But I'd like to see one, I think Larry too, one that brings about this musicians and poets, that do poetry, and there are a number of them in the city of Philadelphia, that we can, have that expression. I think that would be really great.
We used to have a band. You remember Bacchanal on South Street?
Sure.
It was called Glottic. It was a band of poets, and it was all poets who were musicians and musicians who were poets.
Right.
And the interesting one rule we had when we performed was that you couldn't do your own pieces.
Uh-huh.
You could accompany somebody else doing your piece, but everybody had to perform each other's pieces, and then we accompanied each other musically.
Right.
It was a beautiful concept. It was really good. My late brother-in-law, Chris Pedito, who was part of Heat Press, he was part of that. He was one of the organizers of that.
Oh.
And Lamont Steptoe,
Sure.
Shaq, Mbali Moja, Gene Galliano, a lot of great poets that have been reading at Robbins for many years.
All right. Well, I thank you again. It's really been an education for us and for our audience. And I hope you come back again.
Oh man, pleasure, anytime.
All right. So can you take us out with a little music? And we don't have much time for any poetry, but music
this is
would be
the
great.
piece you mentioned. The piece Solitude. It's solitude. I wrote this sitting by the bank of the river in South Carolina. I was touring with some band, and I was kind of stuck there for a couple of days and nothing to do. And I went down by the river, and it was beautiful. It was a summer evening, and I wrote this piece.
And before we do this, we want to thank our technicians at PhillyCam for making this possible, and as they do every month for us. And we'll be back next month, the first Tuesday of the month.
Great, thank you. Solitude.